In the middle of Copenhagen, we talk with Tessa Baliecki, a Carmelite, someone who in this day and age is part of a monastery, convent.
Part of a monastery and a hermitage. Oh yes, I'm an anachronism. And I think that that is a great challenge to society. How could anybody in this day and age be a monk, be a hermit and live in solitude, be a celibate in such a sex-crazed world, and love it? I mean, I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't like it. I think it's an absolutely marvelous way to live. I think that who the monk is has a lot to say to our culture. I think that we're living in such a desacralized society that when I show up dressed like this, looking like I look, living like I live, I make people ask questions about their own lives. That doesn't mean that everybody should run off and become a monk or a celibate, but it makes people say, well, if a person could live like that today and be fulfilled and happy and integrated and not all sort of dried up and miserable, well, then that says something. So it's like a work of art, really.
The way people look at nuns and monks is sometimes like you give up power. Some other people say, no, they're gaining power because they go in this other realm. How do you see that? How do you relate to the power of the world, the war, all the misery?
Oh, all of that misery is very much present to us. When you ask about giving up power, you mean that we don't have any power, or that we don't engage in power struggles, or?
Yeah, well, for instance, you don't come with a Rolls Royce here or something like that.
Oh no, I don't come with a Rolls Royce. I certainly don't. No, we live what we call the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which are for the monk are vows. But we, as we work with people in the world, and that's our main work, we speak of those as virtues, that everyone needs to live the virtue of chastity. That doesn't mean celibacy. There's a way to be chaste and married. We are all called to live a life of chastity, of poverty, and of obedience. And obedience basically, fundamentally, means listening. So in this miserable world in which we live, you ask about the misery. Well, we're listening to that misery and are in relation to that in some kind of way, and then must ask questions, say in our monastery, how are we living that either contributes to that misery or helps to offset that misery and counterbalance it? I mean, we all have a responsibility for the whole planet, and the monk, unlike what most people think, is not trying to escape from that, but takes that responsibility very seriously. This is how I would see it now in my community, which is a new community that's 35 years old. We are trying to build a sanctuary of sanity in a very insane world, not to escape from it, but to model for people what that might look like.
It's just a strange feeling. At the same time, a monastery is separated from the world. On the other hand, it invites people who are sincerely seeking that sanctuary to come and join, even for a short time, to experience with you what that means.
Absolutely.
It's such a shifting walls, really.
Yes, well, what I like to say is that we are a monastery without walls. The old model of the monastery was as a fortress, was as an enclave, separated from the world, almost to be protected from the world. And we are a monastery without walls in the sense that it's permeable boundaries. So there's a sanctuary where you come in and we go out into the world. But the reason that there is some kind of healthy separation is that everyone needs that kind of silence and solitude. So we're providing a space for people who live such fragmented lives that they don't experience enough of their inner wholeness, and also a silent place so they can really hear the deeper things. So
it sounds like a place what in the 60s we called psychotherapy, a place where you go to find yourself.
Well, you do find yourself, but it's not. I wouldn't equate it with that 60s psychotherapeutic stuff, because you really you find yourself as a byproduct of something else. Now, from a Christian point of view, I would have to speak about looking for God, or more correctly, putting myself in a position of being found by God. So there's the great human-divine dynamic going on.
That's an important distinction. Not looking for God, but being found.
Being found.
Not actively going and say, hey, where's the Lord? But
Yes,
up, really.
although some of the being found does does involve a certain, I mean, it's tremendous discipline involved. So there's there's a certain number of practices and disciplines, so you have to be active about it. Otherwise,
But it's
you
not
may not
like
be in the right place at the right time. So for example, I mean, you have to be in a place of silence sometimes to be found. At other times, you may be in a place of terribly great chaos and agony and suffering, and you're found by God. So there's nothing
I have a little
simple and easy.
poem about it. I have 3 children, and I said in the poem once, God gave me 3 watchdogs, and
Yes.
without them, I wouldn't have heard him knock.
Yes. Oh, it's beautiful. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, there's a tendency to think,
God
well,
is
that
everywhere, isn't it?
God is everywhere, and we find Him, He finds us in absolutely everything. What we really need is a return to a reawakening of what was once in the history of Christianity called Christian humanism, which is really what my community represents, is a holistic human attitude towards Christian. You know, we've had a lot of people from Amsterdam come on retreat since the
last
first one of these conferences. So I want to invite the people from Amsterdam to,
come.
to
And
think
you are
about
located
coming.
where in the States?
We are in Crestone, Colorado, in the U.S. We are also in Kemptville, Nova Scotia, Canada, and
It's a bit colder.
it's a bit colder. And we're now starting our 3rd center in Europe. Our first European center is in the northwest of Ireland, in Screen.
In a way, isn't it?
Homeland for some people. I'm Polish. I'm not. Ireland is not my homeland. So.
No, but the atmosphere there makes you feel at home.
Yes, and also the way we live, we are Carmelites, but our whole spirituality is also very Celtic. So we were actually invited by a bishop, which is a unique experience for us, to go and start a center, because we usually just go somewhere and start one. So this now we were asked, and by a bishop. So
it seems that there are, at one hand, we say the church is dying and it doesn't work anymore. On the other hand, you see people like you or Brother David Stander Rustin, who
Yes.
goes around the world and revives this
yes.
tradition.
Yes. Oh, there are elements of the institution that are dying away, as they should. But the heart and soul of the tradition, which is spirituality, which is mysticism, is very much alive. In fact, I get very frustrated at conferences like this, or even in a lot of the reading that I do, because everybody looks to Buddhism. And I read these things about how Buddhism is the answer, and what I read about Buddhism, I say, why do they not know that this is in Christianity? Because it is also in Christianity.
If you would read Meister Eckhart or those guys, they were Zen masters avant la lettre in that.
Yes, exactly. So there are spiritual elements that are tremendously vital and alive, really all over the church. It's this: if all you do is pay attention to what you see in the media, then you're going to have a very negative impression that everything is falling apart and everything is dreadful, because the media. Of course, you're an exception. Look at this marvelous program that you're doing, but the media does tend to look at the spectacularly negative things, and so we.
Yeah, but
we
doesn't that come from a view like the first time I went to Tibet and I saw this potala, rising over the city? I realized that culture there was really not one of equal peer-to-peer spirituality. It was of the lamas up there and the poor people down there.
Yes.
The same if I have it in some monasteries in France that were really like economic strongholds. They were ruling the whole neighborhood or the whole province. And
yes.
I can imagine that people look at that and feel, hey, that's not what we want.
Right.
On the other hand, I see Brother David. I met him many times at Esalen and places like that. When you meet him in the hot tub or whatever, you hardly realize that this is a priest or a monk until he opens his heart.
Right.
What sets him apart from many other people, that he shares this. And I never heard him speak like I don't hear you speak about the specifics of Christianity, why it's different from any other religion.
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels like you're really saying it's not much different. It's my tradition and I like it.
It's my tradition and I like it. Yes, I will say that. I would not say that everyone is the same by any means. There are vast differences, and there should be. That's part of what is the excitement about life. There's man and woman, there's light and dark, there's East and West, there's Christian and Buddhist. So the variety is wonderful, and we don't want to reduce one reality to another. So Christianity and Buddhism are vastly different. And I think that they need to be mutually appreciated for their unique contribution. And I think what we tend to do with everything, when we look at men and women, for example, there's so much man-woman conflict in the world, we tend to look at the negative of one of the parties, if we want to call them that, and the positive of the other. And that's not very fruitful. So if we're going to talk about, say, what's wrong with Christianity, and there's so much to say about that, then we also need to look at the shadow side of Buddhism. And if we're going to talk about what is the angelic or positive side of Buddhism, well, then let's look at what the positive side of Buddhism is, of Christianity is. And the same with men and women. If we're going to, I feel very sorry for men in this day and age. I think that it's very lopsided.
You feel a little bit separated.
Well, and it's terrible, because if it's masculine, bad. Well, yes, some bad things have happened through the masculine in our culture. Well, there are some negative things that relate to the feminine as well, and that needs to be pointed out. So if you want to talk negativities, then let's compare negativities. If we're going to talk about the good qualities and the strong qualities, then let's talk about the good qualities of both. I think that's absolutely essential. Otherwise, it's an unfair meeting.
I have a question in my mind. These days we hear a lot about UFOs and crop circles and stuff like that. It seems like people are looking for a new spirituality, a new meaning, a new contact with something else. They find it in UFOs and the Rockwell. The television is full of it. How do you see that? Is that?
I see that there is a very great hunger, and rightly so. There should be a very great hunger. I see that people look in some pretty crazy directions out of that hunger. And they tend not to look in traditional ways, which I understand. And I think...
What's the fundamental difference between talking to angels or meeting angels or talking to UFOs? If I go back in history, many saints have had experience where they saw...
Oh, well, I have problem with talking to both, actually. I'm a very this-worldly oriented. And I think that what bothers me is a fascination with where, in a sense, we like freak shows, or we like the spectacular, we like the crazy stuff. And the odder it is, the more we go for it. And I think the most miraculous thing is walking on the earth, and the miracle and the wonder of that.
Now here.
Yeah, now here. Be here now. As Ram Dass would say, as the Christian mystics say. Being present in that way is a thoroughly Christian mystical practice or doctrine, however you want to look at it.
And it is thoroughly enjoyable.
And thoroughly enjoyable. Part of our problem is that we are not here now. We're either somewhere in the past, or we're rushing into the future.
Or hoping that this and that would happen.
Yeah, and so it's what the Germans called, and I don't speak good German, so forgive me, but it's Zerrissenheit, where we're torn to pieces.
Yeah.
So we're torn to pieces, and a total fragmentation. And so we need, for me personally, the best kind of meditation, my whole spirituality revolves around the most common, ordinary, earthy things. So we can talk about all these exotic exercises for focusing. If I jump in the lake in front of my hermitage in Nova Scotia and I go for a long swim, that is a tremendous meditation. I have to be there now. Otherwise I'm going to sink.
Yeah.
So the most ordinary things. It's the spirituality of everyday life that is of great interest to me. But what I was aiming at is that I think people, for all kinds of reasons, I understand why people completely ignore the traditional spiritual disciplines around the world. And as Professor Houston Smith says, there's so much wisdom there. All those traditions need to be revitalized, which is part of what my community is doing. But they can't just be thrown out, because it is an enormous, earth wisdom, earth treasure.
Yeah, because he spent some time with the Indians, wrote books about it, although he comes from a similar spiritual background as you,
yes.
a traditional Christian, and
yes.
and he has embraced really this other wisdom, this
Well, that's
traditional Indian and other cultures?
See, no one from now on, and beginning quite a while ago, no one of us can be an isolated tradition. That we all have to be in dialogue with one another and learning from one another. So as Ramon Panakar says, when we come together, what we need is vulnerability to conversion. That means I don't become a Buddhist, but I am a completely different Christian because I've talked to a Buddhist. And when a Buddhist talks to me, that Buddhist must be so vulnerable to conversion that he or she is a completely different kind of Buddhist for having met a Christian. And that's the kind of meeting that we need. So that we are renewing one another, nothing can ever be the same again.
So openness is one.
Openness, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for opening up to us.
Thank
with
you.
this. Thank you.
Hello, Amsterdam.